So welcome to the Bible study. I'm glad that you're here. I brought you a little present. Remember the other night we talked about the 6 marks of discipleship. I think it was Stan Hill who suggested that we should print them up on a little card so people could put that in their wallet and kind of remember what they are. Do you remember what the 6 marks are of discipleship? Pray daily, worship weekly, read the Bible every day, serve at the congregation and beyond.
Stewardship.
That's the last one. Give a tithe. And the one in between is relate with others for spiritual growth, right? So obviously you need these little cards because you've already forgotten. So you may want to put those like in your purse or in your wallet, and every once in a while you can look at them and remind yourself what discipleship is all about. You get an advanced copy because you're such faithful attenders of the Bible study. I'm going to roll these out on Wednesday night. You know, Wednesday nights we're also looking at these marks. And 2 weeks from yesterday, we have the last one of those, and we'll be giving them out to everybody. All right, we're going to get started today. Just to remind us where we are today beginning the third and final part of our 9-session Bible study. So we are now in the last trio. And as you can see where we've been, right? We've been looking at these, what we are calling the transformational keys out of the book that we've also been following. And we've looked at what God's mission is, right? We've looked at developing a vision for God's mission. We've looked at how we need to focus on discipleship and mission rather than on just membership, and what the difference is between a member and a disciple. We talked about cultivating a healthy climate and building a supportive team of staff and leadership. And finally tonight, we get to our favorite topic, conflict. Churches always think that conflict is a bad thing, and they always think that they don't have any. And the truth is, there is always conflict. It's a normal part of life that people disagree and that people are in conflict with each other. It's not that whether you have conflict or not, it's what you do with it. It's how you handle it that determines whether or not you're a healthy church or a dysfunctional one. So we'll talk about that tonight, but before we get to that, just a little recap from last week in case you weren't here or you've already forgotten. We talked about 2 transformational keys last week. The first one was about changing the climate change, not the climate around the earth, right? But the climate in the congregation and what a healthy climate looked like. We talked about adaptive change, so it's not just a matter of finding the right program. It's more a matter of being creative and adaptable and looking at what's going on and being flexible. The 4th transformational key was the staff lay leadership dynamic and how important it is that both the elected leaders and the staff are on the same page, and some strategies to get there. We talked about that last week. We talked about the marks of spirit-led leadership: focus, vision, spiritual grounding, non-anxious presence, intentionality. Remember that? And then we had a lesson from Acts, and we actually did a whole chapter. We looked at chapter 27 and at how Paul was providing leadership even when he wasn't officially the leader. Remember, there was the story about Paul being a prisoner. He's put on a boat. He's on his way to Rome, and he actually rises up to the occasion and provides leadership and tells people what to do, even though he is the prisoner. And supposedly nobody is listening to him. Well, they're not listening to him. That's why there is a shipwreck. But then they listen to him, and he kind of leads them through that whole chapter. So that's where we were. And so today we continue in this book, A Field Guide for the Missional Congregation, where these transformational keys come from. And the 5th transformational key has to do with conflict. There it is. It is important for healthy, spirit-led leadership to stay the course when facing conflict by practicing truth-telling as an opportunity for learning and growing together. Well, that's quite a mouthful. I think we need to unpack that a little bit, right? because there is a lot here. I think staying the course is an important thing. I mean, how often have you seen a situation where somebody objects to something and two people aren't happy with something, and all of a sudden the whole church or the church council focuses on those two people who've been complaining, meanwhile forgetting what it's all about and the direction that they have been moving in, and all of a sudden the dynamics change, right? And you begin to move in a whole different direction. Staying the course means that you remember what your strategy is, that you have a strategic plan, that you have goals and objectives, and that you don't abandon them just because somebody has said something, or someone has started a rumor, or something is going on in the congregation that kind of throws you off course. It also tells you the method to do that by practicing truth telling. Now, Christians are supposed to be honest people. Truth is something that's supposed to come easy for us. But you and I know that truth telling can be really, really hard. Part of the problem is, as Christians, we always want to be so nice all the time. And we just don't want to have conflict. And we want to preserve the peace at all costs. So we often fall into the trap of accommodating the naysayer or the person who is complaining, and because we want to be nice, we don't even say, it's not okay for you to stand up at the meeting and just rant and rave and make everybody feel bad. I mean, we've all seen that happen. And I think we're all guilty of not practicing truth-telling. But when we do, and in the Bible it says, tell the truth in love. This is not about being nasty or screaming at each other or being disrespectful, but telling the truth in love is an opportunity so that we can learn together and grow together, and then the conflict actually becomes something that we can learn from. It doesn't become something that throws us back or that throws us off course. Now, in order to talk about conflict resolution, we really have to leave the book of Acts for just a minute. I know this is an Acts Bible study, but I'm going to take you to Matthew for just a minute, because this is one of my favorite parts of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus talks about conflict resolution. Coleman, would you read it for us?
If a fellow believer hurts you, go and tell him. Work it out between the two of you. If he listens, you've made a friend. If he won't listen, take one or two others along, so that the presence of witnesses will keep things honest, and try again. If he still won't listen, tell the church. If he won't listen to the church, you'll have to start over from scratch. Confront him with the need for repentance, and offer again God's forgiving love.
That, by the way, is the Message translation, which once again I think is just so much clearer than any of the others. It really tells us what Jesus was talking about. So what do you think? What is amazing about this? What do you hear Jesus say? How does Jesus say we should deal with someone we disagree with? Larry? This isn't set up for me to get to people,
Right. Be direct and not triangulate.
Right? Be direct and not triangulate. So you go to the person that's done you wrong or that you have a beef with. That sounds like a simple thing.
Well,
but
it is, because we often serve as messengers for the anonymous people.
Right. Yes, and how many examples can you think of where someone who is unhappy with something that the pastor's done, or that the council president's done, or that the chair of the women's group has done, instead of talking to that person, picks up the phone and goes, did you know what they did? Can I tell you what they said? Can you imagine that pastor? I mean, and then that person calls somebody else. I tell you, the invention of the telephone is yet going to be the death knell of the church. And even worse now, email and texting is even worse, because on email, it's totally unfiltered. And you just tweet something out. Do I have to give examples? You tweet something out that is totally not thought through, right? And that just makes it worse. And then it never fails. It then gets back to the person they are talking about, but not in a direct way, but through 3 other people. And here you have your conflict. And it's just Jesus knew exactly what he was talking about. First step, you go to the person and talk to the person directly, not to your grandmother, to the person directly. What's the second step?
Take someone with you as a witness.
Yes, if the first step doesn't work and the conflict is not resolved, then you try again, and this time you take 2 or 3 others with you. In the Jewish culture, and based on the law of Moses, this witness business is really important. In court, it always took 2 witnesses to corroborate something. That's why it says 2 or 3. And so it's helpful to have someone else there, another pair of ears, so that you have more than, the he said, she said kind of dynamic. That's really easy to happen when it's just the 2 of you. And now, assuming that still doesn't do it, what happens then? Tell the church. What does that mean? Right. Well, in Jesus' day, that meant to go to the community, like you might go and tell Peter, and Peter would bring it to the apostles or something. We're a bit more sophisticated and much more institutional. So we actually have a disciplinary process that's in our Constitution. So if there was a member who has been bad-mouthing the ministry and saying stuff that isn't true, and we've talked to them individually and then with 2 or 3 others, and it's still going on, we can actually bring charges, and there would be a disciplinary process. Now, we always hope that we don't have to do that, and we don't do that very often. I mean, I have never been, once I've been involved in one of those things. When I was serving as a bishop in Maryland, one of the congregations was going that way. But hopefully we won't ever get there. But if we ever needed it, it's there. That's the good thing about having a constitution and having bylaws. Coleman will tell you that. It's for when things go bad that you need those kinds of things.
Somebody obviously does this because the rules change in the model constitution every 3 years.
Right, exactly. And Coleman is chairing a task force right now to look at that and help us kind of update our constitution and bylaws. Well, there is a 4th step. I should have actually gone to the next slide. There is a 4th step. What's the 4th step? Go back to step 1. There is some popular song that always comes into my head at this point, right? Step 3, and if that doesn't work, repeat step 1. Anybody know that song? Now I can't think of it more, but there is one. And this is my favorite part, right? Jesus says, if none of that works, you just go back to step 1 and then you try again. You never give up because you love this person, right? This is how we treat one another as Christian brothers and sisters. We don't give up on each other, and we just try until we can't try anymore. In the NRSV version, he says, you treat this person as you treat the Gentiles. Well, how are we to treat the Gentiles? To love them, to invite them into the faith, to be open with them, to be honest with them. So it's really, this is conflict resolution according to Jesus. And I think it's the best model that I have seen. I mean, you can go to all-day workshops that consultants will do on conflict resolution. As far as I'm concerned, it's right there. I don't think you can get any better. So in our book, in the Transformational Field Guide, this is something that really resonated with me. Conflict is to be expected. It is to be expected. Congregational life in New Testament times certainly knew conflicts. I mean, we always have this romantic notion that right after Jesus, the early church, everything was just wonderful and peace reigned and everybody got along. And we certainly have passages in the New Testament in the book of Acts that talk about this wonderful community that they had. But there was lots of conflict going on too. We'll look at that, some of that tonight. And so they are saying it's normal. Do you hear this? It's normal for congregations of every era to face conflict. The key issue is not whether a congregation will have conflict, but rather how that conflict will be handled. And then they go on, this is actually kind of based on this book, but I added a couple things that I think are important. Those are a couple things to keep in mind as you deal with conflict in churches. You want to de-escalate the conflict situation. It doesn't help anybody for people to be running around and just talking about it and burning up the phone lines or the internet and kind of escalating the conflict rather than always looking for a way to de-escalate it. Again, addressing it directly and honestly, we talked about that. It's important to have a healthy communication system. Again, it's one of those things where you don't always think about it and you only miss it when you need it, right? But you really, if you have a healthy communication systems, if people know what's going on, if you have avenues in which you can communicate and you can be sure that people get the information that you would disseminate, the chance that you're going to end up in conflict and that people misunderstand is much less, right? You have to address gossip, rumor, and third-party complaints. This is really, really important. And that's where churches often fall very short. We just accept it and we kind of ignore it and we'll say, oh yeah, there they go again. But the rumor mill will be going on and people will be talking to each other under the surface, and that is just such an unhealthy kind of a thing. Third-party complaints are really not a healthy way of communicating. And again, it's this, complaining to someone else about something that I did or something that Coleman said, and instead of talking to me or to Coleman, you go to everybody else first. It's not acceptable to have anonymous complaints. When someone at a church council meeting says, well, people are saying, or 5 people came to me to complain about, and you say, well, who are the 5 people? Well, I can't say that. They talk to me in confidence. That might feel like it's the right thing to do, but it's very destructive. It's very destructive because then you allow these anonymous voices, these complainers on the sidelines, right, to actually get power and get attention. We should never accept anonymous complaints. People should, if we can't trust each other, that we can openly come to each other and can say, Coleman, what you said at that meeting the other night really hurt me, and here's why. If we can't do that, if I have to go to Peggy and say, guess what Coleman did to me the other night? He said, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? And then Coleman will find out about it, but not for me. And that's just really, really destructive. Coleman, did you want to comment on that? You took the mic. I was thinking maybe I said something. Oh, was it? Okay. And then, of course, speaking the truth in love, right? That comes out of the 4th chapter of Ephesians. Speaking the truth, we don't always do that. We don't always say, well, this idea that you brought up at the congregational meeting really doesn't fit into our plan and the direction we are now going in. So we can't do that. Instead, we try to accommodate, or we try to sweet talk, or we try to, make the person feel good or something. But we have to do it in love. This is not about being confrontational or losing our temper or anything like that. And then the most important one that I found in the book was stay the course. If we are a congregation that knows where we want to go, we have a plan, we have objectives, we are not going to be thrown off by that because somebody comes up with some other idea that doesn't fit in there. We just have to say, well, that's not what we are about right now. So, anybody got any questions about these things or about anything I have said? Because we're getting close now where you're going to do some work. We're going to look at conflict in the book of Acts. There's lots of them, but I picked 3. So I'm going to invite you to split up into 3 groups and look at these. The first group will look at Acts chapter 6, where there was a complaint about injustice. What happened was that when in the very early Christian community in Jerusalem, you remember where they have everything in common, right? And they take care of the poor by collecting food and other things and resources. And there's a complaint that the Hellenists, the Greek-speaking Christians, early Christians, didn't get their fair share. And that complaint is brought to the apostles, and then the apostles deal with it. So the first group is going to look at that, asking, what is the nature of this conflict? How is the conflict resolved, and what can we learn from it? Those are the simple questions. The second group is going to look at the competing theological differences, and that shows up in various places, but the best place is Acts 15, the first part of Acts 15, where we find out about the conflict between the church in Jerusalem, which is still very Jewish, and then Paul's missions out in the Gentile world. And the question is, do you have to become a Jew first before you can become a Christian? Do you have to be circumcised? Do you have to follow the law of Moses when you join the Christian community? And there's a big conflict. And the church in Antioch, of course, has already answered that question, and they accepting Gentiles into the church. And the folks back in Jerusalem get wind of it. And they actually send somebody to check that out and to say, what's going on with you? Kind of like the papal legate, right, coming to check up on you. So the second group will look at that, again asking the same questions. What is the nature of this conflict? How is the conflict resolved? What can we learn from this example? And then finally, personal disagreements. That's in chapter 15 in the second part. Paul and Barnabas have it out with each other. And it's about really personal stuff. Paul wants to take, Barnabas wants to take John Mark along on the next mission trip, and Paul won't hear it. He doesn't like John Mark. John Mark, he thinks he's a quitter. And so they actually end up stomping off in different directions. Tempus flare, it says in the text, and then they stamp off into different directions. And again, we're going to ask the same three questions. What is the nature? How is the conflict resolved? What can we learn from this example? So you have the freedom to pick whichever group you would like. I'm trusting that they kind of will, come out just about even. They are on the three different tables. There are copies of the text that you are to read out of the Message Bible. So begin with looking at the text and then talk about it. We'll reconvene at 6:45, so you've got about 20 minutes. And we'll talk a little bit about what you found. All right? Go to it. Have fun.
So the way they resolved that was they chose amongst them 7 people who would try to find a resolution. I think it was resolved to the point where the Greek widows were honored, and they got what they needed from the food line. The second conflict was Stephen who got stoned, who very early on was quite articulate and passionate in the church. But amongst them, my sense is that amongst a lot of the newly new members of the church, just trying to get on. They were kind of envious of Stephen, and they really tried their best to discredit them and to put them down and put a muzzle on them. So they bribed a whole bunch of false witnesses to put them down in court, essentially. It's an ancient form of news streaming on Facebook. So.
Others from the group that want to add on?
Well, we sort of agreed that the first situation where the Greek-speaking believers were trying to, feed the widows, help out the widows, and the group said, no, we just can't abandon our responsibility for preaching and teaching. And then they set up this group of 7, so they kind of divided everything so that everybody would be taken care of, so that they could preach and teach and feed the widows. So they resolved it in a healthy way, whereas with Stephen it wasn't resolved in a healthy way. It just escalated because the men who were bribed to lie, created a bigger situation than got started than was at the beginning.
Yeah.
So that was not a good way to solve the conflict.
Well, not for Stephen anyway. He gets
not
killed,
for
right?
Stephen.
But in that first example, I thought that was a good example what it means to stay the course. When the apostles say, well, this is a legitimate problem, but we can't do anything to fix it because we got to preach the word. They didn't abandon what they were about. It would have been so easy for them to say, oh, we got to do something. And before you know it, all they do is, worry about the food pantry and abandon the preaching of the word. No, they didn't do that. They stayed the course. And instead, they found some other people, the first deacons, to then do the kind of service that needed to happen. I think the church can learn a lot from that. All right? Of course. Yeah. Yeah, let me get you the mic so it'll record.
Did the rest of the church know about it? Did the rest of the church know that this was going on and do nothing?
Oh, what do you think? Yeah, I don't know that it says that explicitly, but I would assume so. I mean, Saul was there, right? Who then becomes Paul. So certainly people knew what was going on.
That's not
Oh, that's not your chapter. What a good excuse you guys have. Yeah. Anything else from your group? What can the church learn from this? How can we apply what we saw in the book of Acts to our own situation?
Don't lie.
Don't lie, right? Speak the truth in love.
Right.
There's that again. Yeah. Stay the course and delegate.
Well, and one thing, I was saying how I'm a retired teacher, and how many years ago I had a principal say to us that there was a lot of conflict in the schools because we were forming all of our present day 6th, 7th, and 8th grade middle schools. And he said, if you have, instead of using the word complaint, if you have a question, if you like to, a concern, then air it with some kind of possible way to make it better. And I have used that all of my life, trying to. Not the perfect person, however. But you can use that in any walk of your life,
Yep.
whether it's a church or a business, professional, friends, neighbors, whatever. But always, if you have something that is really bothering you, come up with something that will make it better before you air it, because it makes it a lot easier to understand, to help make the situation better.
All right. Thank you. All right, can we move on? The second group had a really long passage. I didn't write Acts, so it's not my fault. But do you want to tell us in just 2-3 sentences what the conflict was about? Anyone?
Okay, we talked about the fact that there was a new congregation that was doing things a different way, and the conflict was that people in the old church wanted things done the old way. In this particular case, it was circumcision. They insisted that was part of the Mosaic law, so the new congregation should be doing it as well. So that's the conflict.
Yeah, because it's just not Lutheran to do it any other way, right?
Well, how it was resolved is that representatives from that new congregation went back to headquarters and presented what they were faced with, why they thought they should be allowed to exist in the congregation without circumcision. And they had a special meeting to talk about it. Peter stood up and talked a lot about how it's really God's grace and all should be included. That's the message he had. And everybody sort of agreed with it. So by airing that through discussion, putting everything on the table, everybody sort of came to an agreement and then wrote a letter back to the new congregation saying, yes, it's okay, but there are some things in the Mosaic Law. There are 3 little provisions that we really want you to follow, and those were some foundational types of morality. And everybody could agree with that. So that's kind of some of the things we can learn too, is to air those things in a meeting, and get it all talked through, and see if you can get a consensus.
So clearly Peter made a really big impact there, right? If he hadn't stood up and kind of endorsed this new way, it probably wouldn't have come to pass. But why do you think Peter was so open to this new way, to kind of abandon the law, so to speak? Remember back to last week?
It was Peter's vision.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, we talked about Peter's vision, remember? When this sheet comes down with these animals and God tells him it's okay to eat them, and he doesn't have to follow the law of Moses when it comes to the dietary laws. And so he actually starts to eat stuff, and he starts to associate with the Gentiles. We didn't look at that tonight, but there's other stories where then he goes off. Cornelius is a Roman centurion, and he has a relationship with him, and he eats with the Romans and stuff like that. Later on, he kind of backtracks a little bit, and Paul complains about that in one of his letters, but maybe we'll get to that at some point. What else? What did you learn for our own churches today from this passage?
Talk about it.
Okay, yeah.
Don't pretend it will go away.
Right.
If you just ignore
Yeah,
it.
right.
Talk about it.
Yeah. Well, they were I was very impressed with how rationally they approached this. They had a big meeting and decided to hash it out and to just kind of decide. In our church, it's a little bit like that. You know, one of the nice things about the Lutheran church is that it really is a very democratic kind of a church. I've always appreciated that. I grew up Roman Catholic, and the bishop would decide, and the Pope would tell you what to do. The idea that, you know, people of God come together and they talk about it, and they even argue with each other, and then they vote on things, and they elect their bishops. That was very new to me when I first ran into Lutherans, and I think that's so much better to be a church in that way than to have this kind of hierarchical thing. So, all right, anything else from this group? Okay, group 3, tell us what the story is and what you learned from it. You had a very short text, so who wants to speak? Nancy?
I didn't say.
I think you're being appointed.
You were just appointed.
Sandy knows what that feels like.
Okay, we have a Paul and Barnabas situation. Paul wanted to go back and visit all his old friends in the old churches, and he wanted Barnabas to go with him. Barnabas didn't want to go, but he wanted to go another way, and he wanted to take John Mark with him, or John, who's called Mark. And Paul didn't want him to come along. So they ended up just going their separate ways. And Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas. And well, we know what's happened. He had to go a lot of places before he ever got to all those congregations. So they didn't really resolve anything, they just split up.
So what do you learn from that? How about sometimes it's okay to agree to disagree, right? Exactly. I mean, the church actually wins because now you got 2 teams going out. And Paul and Silas go one way, and Barnabas and John Mark go the other way, and the gospel is spread. So it's actually a very positive outcome, even though the personal relationship between the two is probably shot. and they never speak to each other anymore, right? We actually don't know what happened to Barnabas and Silas, because Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, then simply keeps telling about Paul. We don't hear about Barnabas after that. All right. Any last comments? We're almost at the...
Oh, we said stay the course.
Stay the course, okay. We had that in the first group too.
So,
Right? The most important thing was to spread the word, right? It wasn't who got their way or who was right or who was wrong or who liked whom or who liked the other. It was staying the course and spreading the word.
so in this congregation, if you relate to this congregation, sounds like... there
Would you
be-
take the mic, because we want to record
Do
this
I
too?
want to
So.
tell everybody what I think?
Yeah.
We need to have a little bit more conversations about some topics around here and actually figure out how to get people who might be on the fence or on the other direction to feel comfortable to come and talk. I don't think people seem to want to get that comfortable and talk about things, and I don't know how to make them. But
Okay.
since you're the boss,
No, I'm not. Jesus is.
maybe,
All right.
maybe Jesus should maybe Jesus should lead those conversations.
Well, Jesus is here and he leads the conversations through the Holy Spirit, I think. So, all right. So, is there anybody who would like to pray us out? Remember that God listens to lay people more than he listens to pastors. So, who would like to pray? Joseph likes to pray. Okay. I know I could always count on you, Joseph. So.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Good and gracious God, thank you for this group. Help us to spread your word and spread to the people that we don't know. Amen.
Amen. What a great prayer. Thank you so much for coming. Next week, we're going to talk about stewardship. That's the 6th transformational key, and it's one of my favorite topics. So, see you next week.